Hey everyone, here we are for the voiceover for the remainder kind of content part of our protein notes. I'm saving case studies and I'm saving discussion about those papers by Dr. Meyer and her colleagues for tomorrow. So this was approximately the middle of our notes. I believe I just copied and kind of pulled them out here. So we had just been talking about in class that protein is primarily for all those growth structure repair functions, right? Like muscles, bones, tendons, skin, all that whole list. However, it's worth noting that protein is able to be oxidized to produce energy. That's not its primary function, but during prolonged exercise of like several hours, particularly in times when we're not consuming adequate carbohydrate, there is some oxidation of protein, up to about 10% of the calories during that time. So a little case study example would be, let's say you're on a long ride here, burned 800 calories over the course of a couple of hours. There are 4 calories per gram of protein. So if 10% of those calories burned were coming from protein, that's like about 20 grams worth. Anyways, I bring that up to say that it does tend to happen with prolonged exercise. So having adequate protein in the diet, nonetheless, it's not like a performance thing. Like you need enough carbohydrates for good performance. So it's not like you need enough protein for good performance, but think of it more like you need enough protein to support the recovery from those workouts. I'm not going to play this little video link here, but Dr. Luc Van Loon, he runs, and I don't know why it didn't do his name capitalized like it should have. Sometimes when I copy the slides and then put it into a new one for the voiceover, stuff gets funky here. Anyways, Dr. Van Loon runs one of the top protein labs in the world. I'd say Dr. Van Loon and then Dr. Stu Phillips in Canada. So if you see those names, like they're the bosses here with protein metabolism. So listen to him here, but note, everything we've been talking about is scaled to body size, remember? So we were doing some calculations yesterday in class, and I gave the example we were working out what it would be for an athlete of one size to need, like how much protein would this athlete need at one point in time? And I was saying like, that's more than I need. So remember, as you listen here to Dr. Van Loon, he's going to use just absolute numbers like 20 to 25 grams of protein. That is not going to be the same how much do I need for a little tiny female gymnast compared to a big male basketball player and anything in between there. So ideally, we want to scale stuff to body size when we know that information. Here, lots of different foods and this is just a point of reference, nothing to memorize here. But if you're like, so this sounds nice, but I don't even know the protein content of food, this can hopefully help orient you to some stuff. And I think it's worth pointing out, I should have mentioned this with carbohydrates as well. When we see like what one serving is, that's not to say you're supposed to only eat one serving of something necessarily. It's just to say like for a given size, this is how much protein or carbohydrate is in that particular portion. Depending on your energetic needs, you might need more servings than just one. So wanted to clarify that point. Case studies, so that was just nestled in the middle here. We'll do that together. Now, I think this came up a little bit last time. So what if you did your little math calculation and you only supposedly need 20 grams at one time to maximize your muscle protein synthesis, but your dinner had 30 grams, not because you're eating a ridiculously high protein diet, like your plate is a reasonable balance of everything. Maybe you're following the athlete's plate and it was a heavy training day, so you just have a lot of food on your plate. So is more harmful? It's probably not. There are a few different options of what could happen. And it kind of depends, like we were talking about in class last time, about the overall context. If too much protein comes at the expense of carbohydrate, so you're not consuming enough carbohydrate, energy levels might be low. You're probably not going to gain weight necessarily if you're in caloric balance. It's just like a disproportionate amount. Let's say you're eating a good amount of dietary fat and carbohydrate, you just have a ton of extra protein. In that case, it can actually get stored as fat here. So if we trace our different options, we eat food with protein, it gets broken down to amino acids. I don't know if you guys can see my arrow or not, but I'm pointing here at the amino acids. So the big purposes would be to go to body tissues, right? Plasma protein, liver proteins, other body purposes here. Some of it will have the nitrogen group get stripped off, so that's deamination, sent out through the urine as urea. But some of those amino acids are glucogenic, meaning you can use it to make new glucose. So if you're in a time where you don't have enough carbohydrate available, you can use the amino acids to make glucose. Some of it can be processed onto acetyl-CoA. Acetyl-CoA can go into the citric acid cycle, and then the NADH, the FADH2, carries the electrons into the electron transport chain. If we're in a, a spot where we have more energy than we need, so the extra protein is leading to extra calories, in that case, that gets stored as fat. And I think I already told you the example about that football player at the combine who was eating just so much protein and so little carbohydrate. He switched up the ratios a little bit and just felt so much better. But back to the original hypothetical situation, if someone's just having a little bit more on their plate and it's a reasonable distribution with the other macronutrients too, then my guess would be some of it would be oxidized to produce fuel, glucose, acetyl-CoA. So I wouldn't stress about that as long as you're still getting enough carbohydrate and healthy dietary fat. So leucine is one of our essential amino acids. A preferable term these days would be called an indispensable amino acid, because really every single amino acid is essential for making a complete protein. But when we say essential or indispensable, that means you have to get it from food because it's not one of the ones that your body can make. Specifically, this is called a branched chain amino acid. And the other ones represented here, leucine, valine, and isoleucines on the far side. And I realize for the recording, my face is in your way. So cross-reference this with the notes that doesn't have the recording here. But the thing that I want you to take away from this would be the special thing about leucine is it's really the big anabolic signal or trigger for muscle protein synthesis of all of the amino acids. So I think that yesterday kind of briefly mentioned exercise sends a stimulus to your body to upregulate muscle protein synthesis. There's breakdown too, but you are upregulating synthesis. That's independent of anything dietary. That's strictly from the exercise. But another strategy to tell your body to turn on this muscle protein synthesis machinery is from eating, especially eating protein. But within the whole protein, the part that's most important is actually most important for jumpstarting this would be leucine. Sorry, it's kind of loud behind me in the office area. Hopefully you guys can still hear. So the way to look at this slide would be the participants in the study, they had these infusions, various different infusions. One would be glucose, so no protein, just calories, carbohydrate. One would be glucose is part of all of these. So glucose alone, glucose plus the combination of all the branched chain amino acids, leucine, isoleucine, valine. Then it broke it down by the individual branched chain amino acids. Here we've got leucine alone. Here we've got valine alone. And then we've got isoleucine alone. So even without protein, simply consuming glucose led to an increase in the muscle protein synthesis. So that's pretty cool. But if you were to do glucose with the branched chain amino acids, you have a higher response. P less than 0.002 means this is a statistically significant difference. Like, I'm confident the difference observed here is not due to chance. Like, that's due to something intrinsic about what we're measuring here. The next one over, leucine plus glucose, that also is statistically significantly different compared to glucose alone. But then over here for valine and for isoleucine, NS stands for not significant. meaning like if you had glucose plus valine or glucose plus isoleucine, it was not really any different for your body compared to getting glucose alone. So I want you to think about, given these 3 individual responses here, and knowing that the BCA1 is the branched chain amino acid mixture, think about which one of those is probably causing this more robust reaction here. And I'm going to venture to say it's probably the leucine which is driving this, because on its own, valine and isoleucine did not do that. Bottom line, leucine is a big trigger of muscle protein synthesis. All right, so kind of back to the how much do I need for the whole day? You should remember from the start of yesterday, it was a very generous range that's recommended by the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, Dietitians of Canada, American College of Sports Medicine. They're saying somewhere between 1.2 to 2.0 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight per day should be sufficient for athletes. This was a huge study that came out a few years ago. Huge. Systematic review means, like, narratively speaking, we're going through all of the relevant studies on the topic. Meta-analysis and meta-regression are both referring to statistical methods used where they essentially pool the data from all of these studies. The more data points you have, the more power there is in a study. So if you read one study and it gives you one conclusion, that's nice. You read another study and it has maybe a different conclusion. It gets confusing. When you can look at the whole body of literature on, let's say, protein supplementation and resistance training, what do I need to do to get big, to get bigger muscles here? Then taking all of the studies into account, we can get the most accurate picture. So that's what this did. It was looking at resistance training induced gains in muscle mass and strength in healthy adults. So everyone in these studies was engaged in resistance training. That's critical. If you just eat a lot of protein and don't lift, you're not going to get big muscles, or not the way you would if you would be lifting. So this was taking from, on the low end here, 0.8 grams of protein per kilogram body weight. Really, none of the studies provided their athletes with that because it's just not recommended to have it be that low for athletes. But notice that is the RDA for the general population. So point of connection here for you. So moving upwards to the low end of what's recommended for athletes, 1.2 grams of protein per kilo. 1.6, 2.0, this one took it up to 2.4. Each of these little dots is representing results from a study. So not many people took it that high because that's just not typically recommended. But what we can see when we use the line of best fit is initially going from 0.8 to 1.2 to 1.6, it's a linear increase. So more protein, a higher change in fat-free mass. That's what delta FFM means, meaning you're putting on more muscle, more fat-free mass. But beyond this 1.6, it was kind of a breaking point where some people experienced bigger gains with some more protein, some people did not, and opposite. So there was not a consistent increase above 1.6 grams per kilo. So if you're like, but I thought the recommended range goes up to 2, it does. That might be beneficial for some people, especially like the more calories you're burning in a day. If we're eating a balanced meal, that's going to mean more of everything, more carbs, more protein, more fat, just more food. But specifically with respect from this meta-analysis to how much do I need to eat to put on fat-free mass, in other words, primarily muscle, when I'm lifting, the good consensus was about 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram body weight, which is, I mean, a decent amount, but it's not ridiculously huge. Most bodybuilders are eating like way more than that, more than needed. So 1.6 grams per kilo was the take-home message from here. Okay, just a couple more slides here, you guys. I know we're looking at a lot of figures for this one. This is kind of a follow-up to the previous one, and this was a really exciting one. It came out a year or two after the last one. So this particular study was looking at, does protein source matter? Does dietary pattern, more specifically, does that matter? So in this particular study, they took a group of people who for years have been following a vegan diet. That means no meat, no fish, no poultry, no eggs, no dairy, no animal products. So this group of people, it's not like they were just doing it for 2 weeks for a study. You're not going to see good changes with that. But for life, they had been doing this, or at least for several years. Matched with a group who did follow an omnivorous diet, which means you do eat meat and fish and poultry and eggs and dairy. Both groups were matched for how much protein they ate. And of note, neither group was actually eating 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram body weight before the study started. So they did these food logs so that the dietitians on the team could see, like, how much protein are you eating right now? And wherever the person was at, the vegans were given soy protein. The omnivores were given whey protein because whey comes from an animal. So it's not like they could have, in some ways, I kind of wish they had given the same protein source just to standardize that, but I think they did the whey protein and soy because those are pretty common protein sources of supplementation for these two groups respectively. Anyways, both groups received a protein supplement, like a protein powder, a protein shake, that they would have in addition to their normal food so that everybody was eating 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight per day for the duration of the study here. I want to say it was a 12-week study, and they were, 12-week study. Everyone was lifting twice a week, and it was supervised. So it's not like, oh, well, maybe this group followed the workout better than this one. No, it was all supervised by the researchers. And what they were looking at was the change in fat-free mass, or I should say specifically leg lean mass in this case, not whole body, but just the leg specifically. Change in leg lean mass here. The dark gray boxes are for the vegans and the white boxes are for the omnivores. The way to be reading this would be at baseline. The little dot in the middle of the rectangle boxes shows here was the average mass for the leg lean mass. For the vegans, here was the average leg lean mass for the omnivores. And then you can see the range. I want to say that's like the interquartile range within the box. So most people fall within the box. And then the 95% confidence interval is within these whiskers on the sides. So pre and post, they were not significantly different at baseline. After the study, the two groups were still not statistically significantly different from each other. But there was a significant change for both groups from pre to post. So in other words, both groups got stronger and both groups put on some muscle mass. But there was not a difference between the two groups in the degree to which they got stronger and more muscular. Panel B shows the change. So panel A is just like how much mass was there. And then panel B is showing the change in the muscle mass. And again, totally no difference between the two groups. So some key take homes from this would be like, wow, dietary pattern did not impact the degree of hypertrophy in this. Vegans got just as big as omnivores, or flip that around. Omnivores got just as big as vegans. They both put on muscle mass, provided that they were both consuming this adequate amount of protein for optimizing hypertrophy. Pretty cool stuff, you guys. Special considerations. A few other things to be thinking about, like how much do I need within this range? What do I need? Depends on energy availability. Like, are you eating enough calories? If you are cutting calories, your body is more likely to use the protein to provide energy because you're just not getting enough calories or carbohydrate availability. If someone is injured, they might be worried about putting on weight if they're not working out as much. That's not the time to skimp on protein. It might be necessary to reduce some of the calorie intake. You probably won't be quite as hungry anyways if you're not working out as many hours per day. But don't cut down the protein. Your body needs the protein for the healing process to occur. So you could, most likely the thing to reduce would be the carbohydrate, maybe a little bit with the fat too, but especially carbs. Temporary times of needing to cut weight. Hopefully that's done in the off season, under supervision with a dietitian so that we can follow best practices. So all those things considered, that in times of weight loss, you still need to not just retain, but actually emphasize more the protein. So it might feel like you're really on a high protein diet then, because if calories are going down, but protein is going up, protein's taking up a higher amount of those calories then. Don't do this all the time. Like just following up from the last slide. I don't feel like recording it again. I was going to say 2.3 grams of protein per kilogram body weight is totally way more than you need for just normal times. So that would be short-term seasons of weight restriction or energy restriction. And then here's our segue to tomorrow. I strongly, athlete or not, and I really encourage you to think about, in addition to what foods do I like, what foods are available to me at the CAF or elsewhere, but please also think about, what will this food source that's giving me protein, what else will it do to my personal health? So am I choosing a food that, sure, it gives me protein, and it also gives me a heck of a lot of saturated fat and cholesterol and sodium? Don't go for that one on a regular basis, compared to, I'm getting a lot of protein here and not very much of all that other junk I just mentioned. So your own physical health, also the environment. We are at a point where we can't afford to not think about this anymore. There's just not an easy way around it. So even if you're like, I don't see climate change, like I'm fine here in Point Loma, life's great. I think as Christian, if you consider yourself a Christian, we have an extra responsibility to be thinking about how all of our actions impact others, who we may meet or not. Like literally our next door neighbors, also our next door neighbors around the world. We'll talk more about this tomorrow. Also the impact on people who are producing those protein-rich foods. This came to light especially during COVID, when there were exorbitant rates of COVID-19 among meat processing workers, so workers who were working in the meat packing plants. You know what? I just realized I think I've got a student waiting for me on the other side of the door here. And then money matters too. You got to be able to afford it. So on that note here, I'm going to sign off. I can't wait to see you tomorrow. Don't forget to read the article. Talk to you soon. Bye.